This is the Al-Maida Initiative, conversation without compromise.
I think many of the problems in Western history have come from the point where Christians are not expecting to be in any power. Then they get power, then they're terrible with it. So if you look at the first, say, 300 years of church history, you have Christianity being illegal for about 250 years. And then in the Edict of Milan, I believe, that Christianity is made legal in like 312. And I think in like 385 or something, it's made the official state religion. Now,
right,
so you're going from a persecuted underground group to the like official state religion in 80 years, and no one's prepared for that. So what do? You take down the eagles, you put up crosses, you paint crosses on all the legionary shields, you replace the pagan public prayers with the Christian public prayers, you replace the high priesthood with a Christian priesthood, and you get the papacy. And so that's and through that, by having a and sometimes by people doing good things, just not being prepared for the follow through. Like that's one stage of it, and then the big stage of it in Western Europe is under Gregory the Great, and truly a phenomenal leader. But he's the Bishop of Rome, or the Pope.
Right, the Gregorian calendar.
Yeah, but the reason, basically, the state government had collapsed. There's no one left to help people, and there's this huge refugee crisis because the Lombards are invading Italy. And this guy solves the refugee crisis by getting private money to fund and kind of coordinating people to look after each other, and basically fixes and feeds everyone. And at that point, right, there's no state government. This guy is really effective. Well, of course you want that kind of guy, right? I mean, if you can imagine somebody solving unemployment and solving poverty, like, you want that guy as your leader, but they don't think about the follow through. So you kind of get this singular powerful church in Europe that gains more and more power because you don't have a good framework of government. These things just tend to happen in a collapse. So my concern, right, is having a thorough Christian understanding that's based in the Bible and history, which is restrained and thoughtful, not reactionary.
Right, but the issue that, like, that's just one, that's your personal wish interpretation of it, and I just feel like it's just too possible for you to get back the same exact situation we had before with blasphemy laws and killing people for being heretics. And what I'm saying, it's a slippery slope to a large degree, and extremism is something built to human beings to a large extent. I mean, it's very easy for people and societies to go extreme under the right or the wrong circumstances. And once you say, okay, this is a religious country based on Christianity or whatnot, maybe in the beginning or under certain leadership, you'll have a fair state, whatnot, that everybody's treated fine, and it's taking the good things. But it's easy to kind of fall into applying the worst of the Bible. I mean that's something that I see as differentiating, let's say, the Bible from like something like Marxism. Is like, it doesn't have, yes, this whole idea of revolution and whatnot it can lead to violence and whatnot, but it doesn't have all of the laws and whatnot in the Old Testament that people can say, oh, this is in the Bible, so we have to go chop off their heads and stone these people because they did this and that. And maybe in the beginning that's not how it'd be, but that's how it'll end. And that's why I think in the funders of the Constitution, they instituted this strict separation of church and state. And you're right that there's certain things that were based on their understanding, Protestant understanding of religion. All then these are historical and cultural, they're products of their history and their culture. So obviously I'm not saying that that's not true, but they also, I mean, if you read letters or whatnot, you can also see that they're very concerned about, the Bible being used. I mean, the whole, the first, it's called, the Establishment Clause. That's the whole reason why it was put in the first place, is so that there won't be one religion above the other religions, because when that happens, then it can lead to much worse, result. At the same time, you mentioned a few things so far that I didn't really respond to, but I just wanted to kind of bring up in terms of like, that the idea of freedom of speech is Bible, while at the same time the Bible or the Old Testament talks about, as blasphemy laws, and that people who worship other gods, they need to be killed. And then also you have, you mentioned earlier about theft.
Yeah.
In terms of, if the person doesn't have that same law that you're talking about, what do you do? What are you supposed to do according to the Bible if the person doesn't have anything?
They would be an indentured servant until they've paid it off.
Yeah, they'd be slave. They'd be taken as a slave until it's paid off. I mean, that's the problem, right? It's like, okay, the first part maybe makes a little bit of sense, and then you're like, okay, we'll do the second part. And then additionally, it's like, since this hasn't been used in modern times, and we don't even know how that'd be, so it's just testing. Maybe it'll work out, maybe it won't. While we have models, mentioned this in that in that discussion on Facebook, in terms of like, we have other models that work, that are based on science and research and whatnot, that you can apply instead of testing something from a book that's 2,000 years old or older than 2,000 years. You have different models from around the world that do have research that show that these laws work. I mean, it doesn't have to be just because, it says that in the Bible. I mean, I'll give you my perspective. I know I'm a little bit loose, but there's a debate within the Islamic tradition called, there's a theory called maqasidism, or it's like, it literally translate to objectivism, but obviously that has a different meaning in the Western philosophical sense. But it's okay. Are these laws that are in the law for themselves, or are they for an actual objective? And I'm on religious laws, the way that they're formulated, whether they're in the Quran or even in the Bible. I mean, this law, even though it's taken from the context of the Quran and Islamic law, I think it's a good framework and a good way of understand, if a person believes in God or they believe in religion, whether it's Islam, Christianity, or Judaism, or any other religion. It's a good way of trying to understand the religion. I mean, there's different schools of Maqasidism, but one is that, okay, these laws, they're not meant for themselves. They're meant to achieve certain objectives. So instead of saying, okay, we have to chop off this person, I mean, the Islamic traditions, in Sharia, if a person steals, they get their hand cut off, right? Instead of saying, let's do that. What I'm saying right now is actually pretty controversial, even in the Islamic tradition. I mean, there'll be some mad people saying you're saying blasphemy or whatnot, but I'm going to say it. I mean, it's an actual opinion among some jurists, even, that and that was actually applied even during certain historical times, even by Omar, where he paused the whole idea of cutting people's hands off or whatnot for a certain period, because it wasn't achieving the objective that the law was there for, which is to minimize stealing. So when we want to create laws, whether it's secular laws, whether it's based in Christianity or whatnot, I think, for me, my personal perspective is that we should look at what we're trying to achieve. It shouldn't just based on punishing a person. I agree with you. A person should be for reform, right? What's the best and most humane way to reform the individual without, necessarily hurting them or whatnot? I think we have rules for that, whether it's theft or any other area. I mean, when we talk about corporal punishment, which you mentioned, I think most people would agree that it's not a humane way of dealing with people, very inhumane, and whether it's in these religious books and whatnot. But maybe the reason that it's in there is that that's how it was done at the time and that's how it worked. But we don't necessarily have to use the most inhumane method to get to the results that we want to achieve. And most of the research today actually shows that corporal punishment doesn't work. I mean, not necessarily on a legal basis, because there might be some research for that. I need to look into it more in terms of like countries actually use corporal punishment today. But in terms of even just raising your child, tons of research shows that corporal punishment actually makes the kid worse, makes it more likely that they're going to do things, but behind your back, so it becomes so much more secretive. I see that in societies that practice corporal punishment, like let's say Saudi Arabia, in terms of like legal law. I mean, a lot of the things that we're talking about, they still happen, and they happen to a larger extent, possibly even, except nobody knows about it because people are much more secretive. It doesn't really stop crimes from happening. But then you look at like other societies, like some of the Scandinavian countries that are very, the way that they deal with criminals tends to be very humane and very reform based, and rather than just punishment based. And they have excellent results. They have the lowest recidivism rates in the whole world. So that's my personal approach and understanding to these things.
Yeah. So when I'm, so when we talk about, say, indentured servitude after theft, right? So I think it may be a different route when comparing it to Scandinavia, but there's still a prison system in Scandinavia. Now the sentences are lighter and the conditions are nicer, but it's still essentially slavery when you're in it. Like, you're still confined to a specific area. So and much more so in, say, the US prison system.
Right.
Right. So it's not a case of, it's not really a question of freedom or slavery in punishing crimes. It's a question of what kind of limitations are imposed on you in these settings, right? So
but there's a difference between putting somebody in a jail and having them become your personal indentured servant. And when they're your personal indentured servant or slave, the potential for abuse is much higher. I mean, even though our prisons are basically abusive systems anyways, but that's a problem with the American context, not necessarily the idea of jails, which I actually agree with you. I'm not a big fan of jails myself. I think we need to use them a lot less. But, I also don't think that replacing that with corporal punishment or personal indentured servitude is a better approach.
So ultimately, the principles in the Bible are about, one, is about justice for the victim first and foremost, and then reform of the criminal on a secondary sense. So there's a very important question of proper restitution to the victim. So it's not, with what you're talking about, the objectivism sort of theory, that I think there's principles that you do have to wrestle from this, right? So maybe it doesn't necessarily need to look like, you have, you personally work for a person, but we have this in US civil court today. So I have a friend who works in loss prevention for a lot of major retail stores.